Dear friends and colleagues, good evening everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Walkowitz. Dr. Walkowitz is a professor at the Faculty of History and the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University, USA. You can see the names of these departments on the screen. Professor Walkowitz is the author of numerous books, and I will name just a few. The first book appeared in 1978. It was a book about the company towns in the USA and about the labor movement in these cities. This is a book that the professor brought with him, and this is the book that you can find at the library of the Center for Urban History. And there's also an electronic version of the book on company towns, so you can get access to it if you need to. Basically, this book is based on interviews with the Donbass miners, the interviews that the Mr. Professor took together with Louis Sigelbaum. There's another book about the history of the working class. You can hear the name of the book in English. There's another book on the history of folk dance in the U.S. So as you can see, Mr. Professor has a really wide range of research interests. And right now, Professor Walkowitz is working on the history of Jewish heritage politics in 11 countries and in 8 cities, including such cities as Kyiv and Lviv. Apart from that, Professor Walkowitz is a producer of a few movies. One of them is Perestroika from Below. This is the movie that we're going to watch tomorrow at 1700 in the same conference room. And it'll be the first time that this movie will be shown with Ukrainian subtitles. So the Ukrainian subtitles have been prepared by the Center for Urban History. I would like to welcome all of you and encourage all of you to join the screening. And today we're going to talk about the labor history of the United States. In particular, Professor is going to talk about those challenges that traditional industrial regions like the Donbass face. We will be talking about industrialization process, about labor history in general, because it used to be very popular in the past. And you all know that in the Soviet times, labor history was widespread and very common, and a lot of researchers defended their dissertations on this topic. But we can see that this interest has declined. I think that it's also a unique opportunity together with Professor Walkowitz to have a look at the history, but also at the present challenges in this global perspective. Mr. Professor, you're welcome. The floor is yours.
First of all, thank you, Vladimir, for the generous introduction. Can you hear me now? Yes. So I also wish to take the opportunity to thank both the program of DonKult as well as the Center for Urban History for inviting me here to participate, and of course, most particular, Irina Matsevko and Sofia Diak for inviting me here and for the opportunity to participate and share some of what I know with you. I'm going to be speaking in English, and that will be a challenge for the translator, who explains to me that Ukrainian words are like 1.5 times the number of words are needed in Ukrainian as in English. So I've been advised to try to speak slowly, but I'm a New Yorker. We speak quickly. So when I start to speed up, you just go like this, and I'll try to slow down. Let me begin. This past spring, working-class African Americans in Baltimore, Maryland, erupted in violent protest after a black man died at the hands of the police while he was in custody. The African American community had long been frustrated with poor housing, terrible and underfunded schools, and well-documented patterns of police bias toward black men and women, of which the events as they unfolded in Baltimore were just another occurrence. Any hope for change was limited by the lack of jobs. unemployment in such black communities in America was often 50%. In the United States, it is only about 5%. At the same time, two other pieces of employment data noted in recent articles in the New York Times document a racialized picture of labor in America. First, 1.5 million black men are reported as missing in African American communities in the country, either from early death or from incarceration. They are in prison. Indeed, it is what historians often refer to as the American prison industrial complex. Prisons are one of the major industries now in the United States. Finds that at any given moment, 1 in every 3 black men in America are in some relationship to the prison system. They're either in jail, on probation, or they have a prison record that limits their ability to get a job. The prisons, not incidentally, are disproportionately located in rural areas where they provide jobs to white men who are themselves underemployed. So it creates, the prisons themselves create a racialized environment as well. A second piece of information that comes from the New York Times at almost the same time points out what is in fact the prevailing picture in the United States in the last 15 years. It is a picture of vast, not simply unemployment, underemployment, but vast inequality. The top 25 hedge fund managers in this past year, we are told, produced low single-digit returns. That's to say, they underperformed their expectations, but they received $11.62 billion. That's a lot of money in compensation. This is the reality of inequality that is unparalleled in the United States for nearly a century. You have to go back to the period when my grandfather was coming from the Ukraine to find such unemployment, such inequality. Many people at that time came from Galicia, the Lviv region, and they came to America in search of a better life and dreams of money in the streets, which was imagined as just ready to pick up. All you had to do was supposedly be willing to bend down to pick it up. The money was there. Of course, that was a dream. The reality for these immigrants, like my grandfather from Moshtika, was more prosaic and less rewarding. But many in the next generation, like myself, my father was an immigrant from Poland, found good jobs, education. I've lost them. Many in the next generation, like myself, found good jobs, education, and decent housing as we entered the great consumer-driven American middle class. Today, though, we are in fact told that politicians run away from talking about the middle class because too many Americans of modest means fear that they are falling out of it. Deindustrialization, we know, began a half-century ago, following World War II, with the first hints of it. But it has escalated in the last quarter of a century as companies began to move manufacturing jobs to cheap labor markets. Outsourcing of many what we call back-office service jobs followed, including, by the way, for cheap labor, to the Ukraine. I was mentioning to the television station yesterday that we know that, or the Times reports periodically, there are problems of computer, what would we call them, viruses, and they say, oh, they come from Romania, or they come from Russia, or they come from Ukraine. And then when I call to get my computer fixed, the person speaking to me may be from Bangladesh, or from the Philippines, or they're from Ukraine. Because there's an enormous skilled labor force here of highly technically trained people. These are the back offices now increasingly for jobs in American industry. And I'll return to this later because it speaks to a global pattern of labor in which the Ukrainian economy is entwined with the American economy today. These outsourcing of back office service jobs is one part of the picture. Work, nonetheless, in America for some exists, but the social inequality mirrors job inequality. A small, high-tech, financial, professional sector, increasingly in cities, is serviced by a much larger class of workers in temporary, part-time, and effective labor, caring for the children of the rich and cleaning their homes. The latter jobs are typically without pensions, without health care benefits, or eligible for unemployment when people are terminated. These jobs are also disproportionately filled by women and by people of color, who are often paid less than the earlier jobs that have been lost. Of course, in contrast, the hedge fund managers, of which I spoke before, are white and male. All this is only to suggest the ways in which American cities and their labor markets have begun to resemble what historians describe as third world cities, where labor is bifurcated, divided between a small, well-paid tech finance sector and a large, poorly paid service sector. This may be your future, but that's for later. The division extends, of course, to how each group lives and survives. The United States does not have universal health care, and for many above poverty levels, employers do not provide any health care, and private costs are unaffordable. Average apartments in cities like New York are also out of the reach of a majority, though they're not out of reach of foreign corporate and private investors like the aforementioned hedge fund managers. So the events in Baltimore make it apparent that even this falling middle class remains out of reach of many African American and Latino Americans. Now, half a century ago, such observations would have been absent from American universities or from the study of work and labor. Changes in American society and subsequent changes in the universities and the study of labor history first engaged such matters. But it remains to be asked, and they first engaged them in the 1960s and 70s, and I'll try to explain why a bit later. But it remains to be asked if the changed conversation about work and labor and the changed agenda, and if the curriculum has mattered. And can it matter in the Ukraine? What lessons can the story about labor history provide, if any? The story I wish to tell begins in the mid-1960s. But let me start with one marker from a few years later. In 1982, Michael Frisch, a young urban historian who taught upstate New York, a town called Buffalo, and I embarked on a venture to provide what we called at the time, and I quote, an early report from the frontiers of research where young scholars are fashioning the basis for a new understanding of the working class in American history, in American society. The book that came out of that is this, Working Class America. It introduced 11 young scholars who had helped to define something called a new labor history and announce its coming of age. Now, to be sure, a great deal of new and important work has appeared since. But that 1983 collection stands as a marker of an important transitional moment in labor history from which I wish to step back and then move forward. Moving forward, just a few years ago, another press called Continuum commissioned a book to celebrate the 25th anniversary of my editing of that first collection, Working Class America, and allowed us to reflect on the current state of the field. My co-editor for this collection, Donna Havarti-Stack, is herself a leading historian of a generation who in 2009 published a wonderful history called America's Forgotten Holiday, a celebration of the International Labor Day that you celebrate here as well, or did in the Soviet era, May Day. It actually has its origins in America, some think, with the Haymarket Massacre in 1886. It actually has origins even before that. And Americans, because that was seen as a socialist holiday, we don't celebrate that. We celebrate instead Labor Day in early September, which is really more shopping day. It's the day at the end of the summer when everybody celebrates the end of summer vacation and goes shopping. The present moment, however, is an equally auspicious moment for organized labor. For American labor movement stands at a precipice. In the middle of the second decade of the new millennium, less than 1 in 10 workers belong to trade unions in the United States. 1 in 3 did so a century ago. The reasons for this change are complex and merit asking some hard questions. As much about the attitudes of workers, as much about the hostile anti-labor climate they have faced in the past quarter century. The 1980s indeed marked the transition moment, the growing hegemony of what we now call neoliberalism, state-sponsored privatization of services, industry, and the economy that constituted a frontal attack on labor. It's often thought to begin with President Ronald Reagan's crushing of the air traffic controllers in 1981, with the use of non-union workers, as it announced a new anti-labor state regime in the United States. It should be noted that Reagan was enthusiastic about supporting Polish workers in Solidarnosc, just not American workers in the United States. And that was part of a long-standing kind of anti-communism was more important than labor rights in Reagan's position. Paralleled to Reagan's anti-unionism was a similar policy laid out by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in Britain. And together we generally, historians describe this as Reagan-Thatcherism, as a transatlantic state policy of labor management relations in which labor would have to grapple on a global, with which labor has to grapple on a global scale ever since the last 4 decades. The rethinking then of US labor history is part of a larger, ongoing historical project with a history of its own. Now, some of this history may be familiar to a lot of you, and I'm therefore only going to summarize it, if only to establish the intellectual origins of the current subject and to explain why the transition matters. Labor history was not invented in the 1960s. It went back to the early part of the 20th century. It was done by labor economists at Wisconsin, economics professors, not historians. They did what we now call business unionism. They basically studied the trade union movement. Thank you. And they studied it from the perspective of trade union leaders. It was what we would describe as a top-down history. It was not unlike, I should add, the history as it was told in most American colleges and universities. It was a history of dead white men. It's not so different from, I would argue, much of the history as it's told in the Ukraine until about maybe 2015, but at least to 1990. It's certainly much of the kind of history I saw on the square if I go to the history museums. It tends to be a top-down version of documents. This changes dramatically for the first time in the 1960s. It challenges the economic role, the early interpretation. It argues that the labor sources shouldn't simply be those of archives of great leaders. There should be some attention to the rank and file, to people who did the work on the ground. And it challenged an earlier conception of power as that given by the beneficence of top-down leaders. The new social history of the 1960s. Was advanced by this new generation of students whose work was celebrated in that first book that I showed you from 1983. It was a history from the bottom up. I can talk to you later about why I think the 1960s matters, why it happens in the 1960s, but some of you know that it has to do in part with the civil rights movement, with anti-war protests, the beginning of a counterculture. It also has to do with an opening up of universities so that people like you would suddenly be in them. Until the 1960s, most American universities were limited to relative elites. So the population of the universities changes, and students who were there, people like myself, I was the first generation in my family to go to university, all began asking, where are we in the story? Do we matter? How does our presence in the story change the story? The impact for the new social history came for many of us from the writing of a group of British cultural Marxists, most especially the profound writing of a man named Edward Thompson, who wrote a book called The Making of the English Working Class. He was influential, along with a new set of profound intellectuals that were associated with what would become cultural studies, Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall, in suggesting that class was not a structure, as it had been taught, we had been taught in orthodox Marxism, but a historical relationship. Class, wrote Thompson in his famous preface, happens when some people, as a result of common experience, inherited or shared, feel and articulate the identity of their interests as between themselves, as against other men whose interests are different from and usually opposed to theirs. This was the important part. The class experience, he argued, is largely determined by productive relations into which men are born. That's the orthodox Marxism. Or enter involuntarily. But class consciousness, he went on to say, is the way in which these experiences are handled in cultural terms, embodied in traditions, value systems, ideas, and institutional forms. This meant simply expanding it for what had been the old labor history into what we began to call instead a history of the working class, not simply a history of the labor movement. We became as interested in people who chose not to join the unions and trying to understand why did they not join as the people who did join. It became as important to understand what was happening in the churches to which they went. What were they hearing in churches? Did they care about what they were hearing? We began to ask, and what of their wives, who were often doing productive work as well in raising children, in making food, making meals, making it possible for the men to be out at work that supposedly counted as labor? And how did they tell the story? And what about their children? What about attitudes, cultural values? This became a new history of a class in relationship to other classes, not simply a history of the labor movement. the new social historians of working class history. 3 are worth mentioning as very profound in American history for those of you who want to read them. David Brody, who did an important work on non-union steelworkers in America. Those of you who want to understand the steel industry in the Donbass, it's a good place to begin to understand the lives of steelworkers. David Montgomery wrote about labor politics, about workers' control in the workplace, and about older industrial workers. And my own thesis advisor, Herbert Gutman, who wrote increasingly and did work about culture and community, building on the anthropology of Sidney Mintz, began to suggest how good historical work can in fact not patrol the boundaries of history, but can find useful insights from the work of historical anthropology and historical sociology in the work that we do. Central to their work was a rethinking of the subject as more than trade union history. The new labor history, therefore, extended to ethnic and racial identity, to black workers, the black family, slave labor as part of working class history. It began to expand the boundaries and not make them simply national, but as understand that labor itself could be international, part of a transnational project. Thompson himself wrote about the profound influence of people like Thomas Paine, the writing The English Liberty Tree as it informed American workers in the 19th century. Gutman's students, Montgomery's students, Brody's students would pioneer a new immigrant working class, studies of immigrant working class cultures, of Italian Americans, of Irish Americans, of Ukrainian Americans, and of English trade unionists as they informed the politics of the working class. I was a student of Gutman's, as I've said, and my own 1978 dissertation was simply called Working Class Culture in the Gilded Age, and it became the book that was referenced earlier about the company towns, steel workers, iron workers, and textile workers in upstate New York, for which I made a 90-minute film for public television a long time ago. It became the first of many volumes in working class history that since have been published by Illinois University Press. There are now 100 such volumes. My book was the first, and the volume I showed you on working class America was also the third. Why Frisch and why me? Why then? Of course, we were not so old ourselves then. We had already become established with jobs and books that had been cited as a part of the new labor and what was called the new urban history. Michael Frisch had written one of the important essays in that new tradition of urban history. My own work was part of a new set of community studies that were being done of the working class. And as I say, with the funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and now would be the equivalent of about $3 million, had produced this rather lavishly funded docudrama for public television. Out of that, I became increasingly, it should be noted, interested in a project that I think is becoming central to the Center here in urban history, which is public history, the presentation of the past to public audiences more broadly. In 1972, I began the first of yearly travels to the United Kingdom, where I collaborated with the British Society for Labour History, became close friends, compatriots of men and women who organized a history workshop movement. Ralph Samuels, Gareth Stedman Jones, Sally Alexander, Anna Davin, and ran an Anglo-American conference. So American history was really a part of the study of American labor was already part of an international, at least Anglo-American and Anglo-American French and German movement. We didn't write in isolation. That's to say, it should be understood that American historians were standing on the shoulders of the British and Europeans. People like Georges Udet, Charles Tilley, scholars like Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm, to move this labor history into the working class history. As a subject less tied to white male leaders and reconstituted, reimagined, imagining its subject as a working class at home, in the community, and in the workplace, both union and non-union. This was history from the bottom up, not the top down. And it meant not just to add more people, but it meant to suggest that it provided a different understanding of how the past was made. It wasn't simply imposed on people. It was much more dialectical. It was shaped by exchanges between people with different kinds of sources of power. It was a different formulation of how the past was made and by whom. These exciting times produced fertile work in graduate centers. We put out a call for papers, and that's how that book I've mentioned appeared. These are the papers. We had 100 submissions. All the books that came out of these papers, I might add, became important books. We were extraordinarily fortunate. Some have moved on, like Sean Wilentz, who's at Princeton, wrote a book called Chance Democratic, a very important book, about the making of an American working class in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s in New York. He's moved on to write biographies of Reagan, Bob Dylan. Others, like Christine Stanzel, the book City of Women, suggested that the history of the working class was a gendered history, not simply a history of men. She moved on to write histories of Greenwich Village, Bohemia. Others, like Leon Fink, edits the major journal in American labor history called Labor. And others have become the senior ranks of American labor historians who are training the new generation. One couple, Elizabeth and Kenneth Fones Wolfe, are the only ones who co-authored it. They co-authored an essay on trade union evangelicalism, trade union religion, and their work on Appalachia and working class history gives them a unique purchase on an area little studied, and so they appear in both the 1983 book and in the 2010 volume. As Frisch's and my own first book titles, however, suggest, most of the work done through the 1980s consisted of industrial working class communities, textiles, garments, auto, transit. To be sure, some were more than that. Wilentz opened up a study of industrialization as more than a study of factories and technology. And feminist historians like Stanzel and Susan Porter Benson gave a centrality to women and gender relations that even historians of shoes and textiles, work that was often done by women, ignored. The focus of most of these, and it should be noted, some of the essays moved the study into mass production industries in the early 20th century. But very little of this work advanced beyond the 1930s, the early 1940s. So the last 80 years of our labor history was largely ignored. One essay by Sue Benson, a study of women department store workers, I want to point to only because it foreshadowed a rethinking of class and gender relations that would reshape how labor history would be imagined and needs to be imagined and has been more recently imagined. The generation that wrote Working Class America led to the rethinking of working class history in the United States. But Reagan-Thatcherism increasingly moved that work off center stage. It was replaced by a new infatuation with cultural history. Cultural history was celebrated, and social history was increasingly in decline. And why? And to what effect? Well, first, it should be noted there are different forms of cultural history. Cultural history is also old. Older forms were the study from the top down of libraries, religious organizations. But like the early old-fashioned labor history, they were studies that were done by looking at the lectures of the priests, the rabbis, or the directors of the library. They didn't look at what were people reading. They didn't look at what were people taking out of church, what were they hearing. They didn't, again, do a history from the bottom up in cultural institutions either. It was, that's to say, the early cultural history top down and tended to be rather close to the genre of intellectual history. Great authors, mostly men. But in the 1980s, some people, most especially a Princeton professor by the name of Lawrence Stone, began to insist that social history was putting too much focus on your lives. And it was doing it in different communities. And what we were losing was a sense of the grand narrative. And he argued we have to put the great men back into the center of the story. That history, as it was being written, was balkanized into little isolated communities, and we needed some master narrative. Synthesis. Indeed, that synthesis was also congenial, I would argue, with Reagan-Thatcherism, and got caught up in what in the late 1980s and the 1990s became known as the culture wars in the United States, in which politicians and historians began to debate whose story mattered. In the culture wars, conservatives argued, we're hearing too much about the lives of black slaves, we're hearing too much about the lives of workers, we need to hear more about people like Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, famous inventors, major politicians. By the early 1990s, however, feminist historians suggested a way out, an answer. It came in the rise of what we associate as post-structuralism and the linguistic turn in historical writing. And it was led by feminist historians, people of labor like Joan Scott and Ava Barron. They stimulated the rise of a new gendered labor history. women workers in cotton mills, textile workers, and as domestic servants had long been the subject of study. But few of us interrogated how gender mattered. It wasn't just putting them there, how did it change the story? How did the place of women and their subjectivities shape the historical experience? Fewer male historians even ask similar questions of men. How did masculinity matter? How did patriarchy, how did male culture, for instance, shape experiences? It was a bitter time of conflict between male and female labor historians, I might note, in the 90s. In time, women's history morphed into gendered history. And it would come to include, as it does now, both men and women, queer and straight. Feminist postmodern writing further fueled, however, a neoconservative backlash. Politicians weren't thrilled with the notion that university professors were talking about queer people, much less about women so much. And they began to complain about how the focus on subjectivity was obliterating any master narrative. And male historians, with their own misogyny, were arguing that the primacy of gender was diminishing or ignoring the place of class. That a concern with representation was ignoring the material realities of everyday life. The complaint about post-structuralism was that people were saying, here's the image of poverty, but they weren't focusing enough on the reality of poverty. Of course, that wasn't true. People rather were concerned with the relationship between the two. By the beginning of the new millennium, labor historians finally buried the postmodern hatchet and united against the attack now all felt in what was increasingly a disregard for labor in classrooms and in the state houses. When I started teaching in the 1970s, 80s, our classes were full in courses in labor history. By the 90s, the opening decade of the 20th century, there are virtually no classes in labor history. If you teach a class, however, and call it social history, you can do as much labor history as you want. And students are interested in it, but it had become out of fashion to be engaged in the subject of labor history because it was being attacked as old-fashioned studies of Marxism or class. It was hardly that. But by the turn of the new millennium, the debate with postmodernism had become passé, as most historians working in working class history had come to realize that no one advocated the disregard for the material facts of daily life. Just rather, and this became, I think, the abiding lesson of the linguistic turn in post-structuralism, that facts are constructed, they're contested, they're mediated by how people with varying degrees of power understand these conditions. So, with neoliberalism in full bloom today, with the deepest recession in America since the 1930s, with greater inequality than a century ago, and with a very diminished labor movement under attack, we published the book Rethinking. Central to this new work were, we thought, the new directions that labor history could go, that this new history of the working class could go. And I put it forward to you as a way of beginning to open a conversation about whether it can be helpful in the Ukraine. What was central to the new work? First of all, that we pay attention to languages of class. It was addressing a question that I asked us a decade ago in a book I wrote, which I called Working with Class. How do you write a history of the working class when everyone thinks they're middle class? We begin by addressing the meaning of class, the languages of class. Second, redefinitions of labor. Much of the early work was about old industrial labor. But most of that work in manufacturing, since deindustrialization, cannot be found in our cities. Show me the ironworks in Lviv. Show me the automobile factories. Show me the textile mills. Show me the coal mines. These were the subjects of old industrial labor. But does that mean that there is no working class? There are no people who do labor and do it for a wage or a salary as dependent for a job for someone else? These are areas that are not old blue-collar labor, but what we would call white and pink-collar labor. Third, or second, not only do we need to be attentive to these new areas of labor, but also to what is called affective labor. Services in the helping professions. Often that is unpaid labor, part of a movement that began in the 80s that was called wages for housework. Does it mean because you are not paid that you're not working? And how does the work, unpaid often, that people do or underpaid, make it possible for other people to do work, raise children, provide food? Third, we need to rethink strategies for unraveling working class life. This includes thinking about, for instance, the history of the census. Finally, a new social history, not of social history against cultural history, but rather one that changes the boundaries to understand that the history of labor of the working class is a social, cultural study on the one hand, and social, political on the other, including concerns with the role of the state. The volume ends with 3 essays that suggest alternative strategies. I will mention them only briefly because of time. Let me mention what these essays do. First of all, they suggest alternative forms of working class identities. That we begin to think of hybrid identities. What's the difference between strikebreakers and strikers that often look exactly the same? What is the ambiguous role of religion in working class life? Second, we look at the role of the state. Jennifer Klein and Eileen Boris, it's a profoundly important study, look at California care workers' unionism. Joseph McCartan studies the role of the state in undermining labor organizing in the 20th century. Third area, broadening the study of who is a worker. Soldiers as workers in one study, military laborers. Another essay looks at marginalized home care workers, where work is often hidden in the home. Fourth area is a post-revisionist critique of radical politics that begins to not simply look at socialist and labor politics, but also tries to rehabilitate what is the role of anti-communist politics in local community work. And lastly, the essay, Working Class America in 1983, expanded social history from the bottom up. The new work expands the geographic and the temporal reach. It is now transnational and comparative. It includes both the political history of labor and the cultural history of labor. The volume ends with different new directions that talk about the history of the senses, the role of gendered history, labor history, and poignantly for those of us who teach at New York University, the role of graduate students as workers in efforts to unionize in the university, and the role that the state has played in often determining whether you're allowed to unionize or not, because it has determined whether you are a worker or not. But let me move to a conclusion and try to talk a little bit about the present and what lessons we might take from all of this for today. I want to begin by just recapitulating briefly points I made at the outset. First of all, inequality is unprecedented. For sure, you have that here. Secondly, that cities are mirroring the social gulfs associated with third world sites. Increasingly small, high-tech professional workforce and large numbers of people who live marginal lives. The difference between rural Ukraine and urban Ukraine. The people I pass selling flowers and food on the street, and other people who are working in jobs. One group in America is typically white and male, the other disproportionately black and Hispanic. Here the differences need to be explored as well, whether they're rural, urban, male, female, old, young, etc. And finally, the disappearance of the middle, the old and how in fact has work changed in Ukraine is much a question like how it has changed in America. The middle in America, American cities, which was a manufacturing base, has largely disappeared. How is labor and work and opportunities for labor and work changing here? When I think, for instance, about the Donbass, I think about steel and coal, but I know from 25 years ago, those coal miners were spending 2 hours just walking to work underneath. Those mines were producing high sulfur content coal that of little use. Many of those mines' conditions were those that American mines had ended as unsafe 50 years ago. The real issue isn't whether miners are working, but what other kinds of new work are we going to find for those people, because those mines should be closed. And what role is the state going to play in helping to retrain, to recreate a new meaningful forms of labor? Not busy work, but meaningful work that people can enjoy, take pleasure in, and earn a living wage, not a subsistence wage. Two new directions, it seems to me, hold the promise of providing an analytic purchase on these changes, both in the United States and in Ukraine. First, American universities are rushing to embrace a new area, not simply what we would call the history of the working class, but it's called capitalism studies. It is not simply the acceptance of capitalism as a fact of life, it is studying capitalism and how does it exist. It's making it a subject of study. It is not simply naturalized as ahistorical, which is how it has been treated in the United States, but again as the serious focus of study. Typical is the work of a book in which this past year won the prize-winning Bancroft Prize, A History of Cotton, called Empire of Cotton, by the Harvard historian Sven Beckert. A history that spans 2,000 years and 4 continents. Its focus is the cotton empire in the United States, but it says one cannot understand that history without understanding it over a longue durée, as well, that is temporal as well as physical. Beyond capitalism studies, the second area that has been most generative of rethinking is transnational history, which is challenging historians to rethink the traditional organization of the past into national histories. This is especially challenging, I would imagine, in a place like the Ukraine, which is so concerned with its own national identity and preserving the state against encroaches from hostile neighbors, especially one to the north and slightly to the east. Nonetheless, we increasingly know that our histories are not defined by national boundaries. Labor history has long appreciated the role of international markets of labor and of commodities. Immigrants cross borders for work. Labor companies cross borders anytime they want to find cheap labor. Outsourcing is only the present formulation of corporate moves to cheap labor that have a very long history. A wonderful example of this work is that of a Cornell labor historian, Jefferson Cowie. His book, I heartily recommend to you, is called Capital Moves. You can hear in its title, it is both transnational and capitalism studies. He is a labor historian. He traces how the General Electric Company moves from Camden, New Jersey. That's a very poor city across from Philadelphia. Right after the war, World War II. And when labor there gets expensive, the workers organize, the company picks itself up, and it moves to the Midwest, Bloomington, Indiana. And it sets up shop there. 20 years later, the workers organize. Labor gets expensive, the company picks itself up, and it moves to Juarez, Mexico, and sets up shop there. Capital moves. Today, the workers from Juarez are communicating with the workers in Bloomington, because we know that not only does capital move, but the internet and telephone lines don't honor national boundaries either, and they can communicate. So we see the importance of regional, transnational, and global political, cultural, and economic players and institutions. So Baltimore tells a story of class and race, but of course unemployment, underemployment, racism takes place against a backdrop of deindustrialization and the outsourcing of American jobs to South Asia and to the back offices in places like the Ukraine that I promise you even some of those African American workers would like to have. In the Ukraine, divisions are regional, ethnic, occupational. We see an embrace of entrepreneurship, of a discrediting of idealized Soviet-era proletarian heroes, represented in privileged positions and the privileged salaries of miners and steelworkers in the past in the Donbass. The challenge today in the US, and I suspect in the Ukraine, is to then build a national consensus and a transnational world of opportunity labor, and thus to avoid a narrow nationalism that ignores differences, while recovering a history of citizen workers, including the important citizen workers in places like the Donbass, who did much in the past to build the economy, but in industries that no longer need their labor, but for which we still need to think about what their role for the past has been and what their role for the future might be. It may be that the United States does not have simple lessons for the Ukraine, but rather the lesson may simply be that the economies of both are entwined in labor markets, in economic players like the World Bank, in highly politicized and problematic institutions like NATO, etc. In the past, both the United States and the Ukraine, a vital labor movement served as an engine we know for social welfare. The pensions that Americans have, when Americans decide they want to have a Labor Day, when we want to have vacations, all those days were won by the labor movement. Pensions, Social Security, were won by the labor movement in the 1930s. So we need to ask, what does it mean to no longer have a vital labor movement there? And what might it mean to not have one here? Or what might it mean to insist that we need to have one here? In both countries, we need to be careful that the rush to embrace neoliberal privatization, the entrepreneurchniks, does not dismantle the one institution that historically, and perhaps in the future, we may need to move forward in creating a just society. That is a vital labor movement. Thank you.
Mr. Professor, thank you very much for your great lecture. And now it's time for questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand.
Can I ask it in English? Sure. It's okay. One of the points you made was that income inequality has never been this bad for 100 years. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And do you have is there economic data to support this?
Yeah, there's a
because
lot.
that's not my understanding. I mean, basically, the average incomes have not improved in 30 years. But if I compare the standard of living now to 1910,
I'm not talking about the.
No.
What do you want me to do? I wasn't referencing the standard of living. The standard of living has changed. The disparity between rich and poor is as wide today as it was 100 years ago. So it's the income disparity that is as large as it has been since the early part of the 20th century. And at the bottom, the level of the people who are underemployed below the poverty level, the standard of living has not risen as dramatically as the picture you would otherwise tell. At the top and the bottom, it certainly is a very different standard of living. But the gap is as wide as it ever was. I read data today that suggested, for instance, there are more Americans on disability today than there are on American assembly lines.
but that may be because of the very liberal rules of getting disability, which has been gained by a lot of people, which wasn't true in the past.
Well, as far as many conservatives were concerned, there was an enormous gaming of the welfare department as well, and so in the
You should speak to microphone.
In the 1950s, for instance, there was a major cutback in welfare. She wants me to speak here. Okay, take.
I think this is the easiest way.
Can you hear this? Follow? Okay. In the 1950s, as an example, welfare had enormous cutbacks because there was a general concern that there were men hiding under the beds, and that there was an enormous expansion of welfare rolls in the 60s, were all of those kinds of complaints as well. There's no question that there was abuse. There are real questions about how much abuse there is and how much there is. Disability is, you're quite right, that's a very different matter. Disability has been, especially in some industries like transportation and others, there's lots of evidence of a lot of abuse. No question about that.
While our participants are thinking, I will ask a question. As far as I understand, to a large extent, the subject of the labor history, has been changing. Can you hear me? 1, 2, 3, can you hear me? 1, 2, 3, can you hear me? Мене просто пан професор не чує. Напевно, щось не так з навушниками. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. As far as I understand, to a large extent, the subject of labor history was changing due to the changes in the economic situation, or due to the changes of priorities. For example, you were talking about the emergence of pink collars. And right now we can observe economic transformations, and more economy is moving to virtual space, to the internet. And in this regard, what are the requirements that are imposed on labor, maybe some new methods or some new tools that can be used? Do you understand my question? So since the economy is moving to the virtual space, to the economy, what are the new requirements for labor in this context?
I think there are going to be...
You can use this.
I think there will be, and there's some evidence that there are new imaginings about labor organizing. So there is a freelancers union, for instance, that has started in several cities. I often try to remind people that I'm an historian and I have a hard enough time understanding the past. The idea of trying to predict the future is above my pay grade.
It will be in Ukrainian, so please. It will be in Ukrainian, so please take your head.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your interesting lecture. I think that this lecture is very important, and the topic of this lecture is very important for all of us, in particular for Ukrainian historians. Because we had labor Soviet history, and it was very ideologized. And I think that in the Soviet times, about 50% of dissertations and theses were devoted to labor movement, to the victory of the October Revolution, and to the role of workers in this October Revolution. Right now, the situation in Russia with labor history is a little bit better. But in Ukraine, it looks like we have discarded this Soviet ideologized labor history, and we do not have anything in exchange, in return. So what is your advice? Because when you don't have anything, it's very difficult to shift to all these new trends or areas that you mentioned in your lecture, the new trends in the modern US labor history. I mean, when you don't have anything, it's just impossible to shift to all these new trends. So what is your advice in this context? Your advice as a professional historian, this is my first question. And my second question is related to what you said about the blurring boundaries of the working class. And I have a question related to the labor class as part of the middle class. Right now, we are living in the post-industrial epoch and in the era of the information society where priorities are completely different. What challenges do you see for the labor history of the future? And don't you think that the working class might disappear as such in this post-industrial information technology society?
Again, I'll begin with the second question. I have no idea what will happen in the future, but if I have to project, I would only say, first of all, that I think that the languages and categories that we use from the past will not always be useful in the ways in which we understand the present. So one thing it seems to me that we usefully can do is in studying the people around us, become sensitive to what kind of categories and understandings they're using. That's their own subjectivity. As I said, I wrote a book about how do you write a history of the working class when everyone thinks they're middle class. And the objective of that book was to make everyone very anxious about ever using the term middle class. Because, in the United States at one point, 80% of Americans all describe themselves as middle class. So, what does it mean? That doesn't mean you stop using it. You talk about the fact that they're using it, but you also look at their material conditions and you try to understand how, when are they using the term and what other terms they're using. There has been some interesting work by sociologists, a man named David Haley, who studies chemical workers in New Jersey in the 1980s. And he has found that the language that they were often using was this new kind of hybrid category. They call themselves middle-class workers. And they describe themselves as working class in the factory and middle class at home. And to complicate the story even more, they may use the term in describing themselves, but they often don't use it in describing others, and that becomes a kind of way of unpacking the meanings that class have for people. And that's different from just understanding them as working class. So, for instance, these chemical workers describe themselves as working class in the factory, but they said, oh, the woman who's working in, the secretary who's working in the office of the chemical factory, she's not working class, she's middle class, she's a secretary. And our wives, they're not working class, they're all middle class at home, they're taking care of kids and they're not working at all. But when we talk to the wives, they all said, of course we're working class in what we're doing. The piece of the story that gets even more interesting, of course, is these were all white people. So it's not uncommon to find that the language of class will be different even with race. A black middle class doesn't have the same meaning as a white middle class might have. So it's partially a way of unpacking all of that. How do you go about doing all of this? What's the future for the Ukraine in writing their own history? Well, look, part of the difficulty is we all inherit traditions and ways of thinking about the past, and we do have a legacy from the Soviet Union in terms of the training that was done, the kinds of thinking that was done, the books that you were reading. You can't throw that all out, and there may be some useful things from that past. So I wouldn't just suggest throw it all out. But there are a lot of other things that you now have access to reading. I'm remarkably struck that you would ask such a question when you're in fact here at the Center for Urban History, which in my mind is one of the places, in fact, that is as courant as any and has taken as its objective mission both to bring people like myself and others here and is training a whole new generation of students. I see that in Kiev at Mikalo University. I mean, at the Mikalo Academy, there are nooks and crannies in between places where interesting and good work is being done. You know, it's not as if all the work in the United States is worth reading either. You know, most historians, after all, are shoe salesmen. So some of the work is good, some of it isn't quite so good, so you pick and choose. But I've tried to give you a shopping list of some places to start. You want to start? Take a week off and go read The Making of the English Working Class. That's a good place to start. You know, and then go read Hobsbawm, and then go read John Scott, and a lot of the, go read this book, Capital Moves. And I've tried to give you, again, some places that you can begin. But I think that part of the lesson that we know in this new work that's been done is that the working class, as we would have understood it in the past, and labor is real, it does exist, but it doesn't exist in the old industrial forms that we've had. It will be, there'll be people who are nonetheless working for dependent wage laborers. They're working for salaries, and you know, they need to be taken seriously and studied for the kind of work that they do, both in their settings as well as, you know, there are people who are doing work in internet companies. They're fascinating. They call much of this new work that's been done. I've been asked to speak at a couple of Silicon Valley and Silicon Alley startup move. It's called. They call themselves makers. And there is a whole makers movement. You can go do a Google search and read about these people. And they're incredibly fascinating because they are people who resemble in many ways artisans from the 1830s, 40s, and 50s in the kinds of work that they're doing. And they're often trying to challenge a lot of the capitalist modes in which they've been engaged. But they're trapped in them at the same time because they want to become bigger and better and then sell themselves out. So there are all the contradictions of those movements and things to work at. There are incredible, you know, things are being transformed day and night. One of the, as you know, I'm retiring formally from my university position next month. And people ask me about that. Well, I'm hardly going to stop writing and thinking and doing other things, but it's going to be challenging to be in universities in the next generation. Education is being transformed. The jobs of university teachers are being transformed. It is going to create enormous sets of possibilities and problems. And they are not unlike the problems of imagining work and how they're going to be done and understood, and for people's ability both to do work and to control the kind of work they do and the salary they get from them. And it's going to require these kinds of new conceptions of where is work and what is the kind of work that we do. And part of the lessons, it seems to me, that the young scholars that I've been publishing and who I see around that's interesting to me is that they're looking in places that have never been honored as important sites for work. So if we have, for instance, such enormous armed forces, we need to look at the conditions of soldiers who are, after all, you know, paid for the work they do rather poorly. And sometimes they're trained in the kind of work they do and understand that labor force, if you like. Care workers, the work that women do that's underpaid and sometimes only partially paid, never been understood. Freelancers are a good example of people who are now trying to, they don't work for a dependent wage, they work on their own, but they recognize that in order to get benefits in society, they need to think about some kind of collective identity and organization. So I don't know what direction it's going to take. The areas where we're seeing some of the major growth, ironically, have been in some of the standard professions that historically were opposed to unionizing. Doctors, who often hung their shingle in the past, increasingly now find themselves working in collective settings, and then in various cities they're forming proto-unions of different sorts. So I don't know what form this will take because the conditions under which we work are being transformed. But the place where one sees this being challenged and done is the rethinking of the historical profession. I see it here. So you know the answer. It's they should take your classes.
У вас ще є питання? Добре. Все, тоді про завтра. Дякую всім тоді за питання.
There are no other questions. Then I want to say thank you to all the participants for your attention. I want to say thank you to Mr. Professor for your interesting lecture. I also want to remind you that the DonKult Cultural Forum is still on, and tomorrow we will have a great opportunity to watch the movie shot by Professor Walkowitz based on the interviews with minors. And we will discuss this movie. The story of this movie is very interesting because they went there to take some interviews with the miners, but at that time the strike was in full swing, and so the miners started talking about this strike. So we will watch the movie first, and after that we will have the opportunity to discuss the movie with the professor, and the professor will tell us more about how they interviewed the miners and how they were shooting this movie. Thank you very much.